This is the Changed Physician, episode 146. Welcome back to the Changed Physician. I am Melissa Cady, the Challenge Doctor, with my co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro. And today is going to be a fancy host chat discussing the last two episodes with Dr. Kelly Casperson. If you didn't catch those, episode 144 and 145, it is about the story of the urologist podcaster, Dr. Kelly Casperson, and a complete focus on sex on the episode 145. So we're going to just do a little chatting and diving in a little bit about these last couple conversations because they were a lot of fun and informative and interesting. And she's just a cool chick. I hope she doesn't mind me calling her cool chick.
Okay. I don't think she would mind too much. She was pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, the one thing we kind of mentioned our Saturday salutations recently is that we talked about how neat it is to share information outside of just your traditional medical training, especially if you're repeating yourself over and over again and you don't have time during visits, which I think that was a really important point to take away with some of the conversations we had with Dr. Casperson. If you can dive into a little additional training that is kind of in the wellness world that really ties into real practical things and helpful things, especially when you don't get it in your medical training. I think that's a perfect blend, especially when you have the expertise that Dr. Casperson has. I mean, she does surgery. She's been doing training and extensive training to the point where she almost felt like, should I finish out my training? Because it's hard as hell. So I think the fact that she stuck to it in her story, that was the first episode. I love the fact that she held on, which a lot of us do. I think a lot of us just, put up with it's kind of like the hamster gets in the wheel and it just keeps going and you just don't get off because it's just easier to keep going. And you have all those bills and loans to pay off anyway. You're going to have to be able to afford those for most people. But the fact that she kept on with that and had the willingness to extend her knowledge and expertise for the benefit of her patients. And like she said, she didn't have to do the podcast, but it only made sense because she doesn't have time during regular visits to really discuss these long-winded conversations and education that we desperately need. Any thoughts about that long-winded comment?
If we're going to kind of deep dive the episode, there was a couple pieces that are key. I think the one that you mentioned that was fairly early on was in the physician journey was residency. And I think that is important for anybody out there. Is residency is hard, and it's particularly hard when you are in it, and becomes very, very difficult to predict what it's going to be like when you're done. And I think that's important because there's burnout, and we understand burnout, and we have people frustrated. That's one of the reasons we created the Changed Physician podcast. But it is very, very difficult to make good decisions when you're in the middle of residency. And I think that's a key takeaway. If you are a medical student or if you're a resident and you are struggling, that is not necessarily the best time to make a decision like, I'm going to quit. Obviously, if you're having significant mental health issues, if you're worried or there's concerns about self-harm, maybe you're in a super malignant program, that's a different story. But for everybody else out there, residency is not easy. It simply is not. It's the nature of the beast. I don't know how you can make it super easy because we were dealing in life and death situations. So if you are thinking about quitting, I think the important thing is to not do it then and maybe get some outside information. Because I think if someone talked to Dr. Kelly Casperson as the urologist and she was struggling during residency because it's hard, and then they talked to future Dr. Casperson, Kelly now with the podcasting and a really successful thriving practice, I think the information she would have told herself through that point was, would not have been to quit. So I think that is a key takeaway there. If you're struggling, it's natural, it's hard. But it is very, very difficult when you are in the throes of this is so hard to be able to think outside of, well, actually, what's the future me going to be thinking and feeling, 3 years, 2 years, 4 years down the line. In fact, it's extremely difficult to do. So I think that was a really important takeaway. Probably because I went through that too. I don't know when like the first year of anesthesia was so freaking stressful. Like I can't even, and it was so known. This is what I loved about my program. So I did my residency in the University of Chicago, loved University of Chicago. It was hard. I have a lot of good feelings about that institution though. And our program director in the first month said, if you feel like quitting, I'm gonna ask you to do is stick it out for 6 months and then talk to us. Yeah. And just setting that, what that told me was I wasn't alone, right? Mm-hmm. Isn't that the craziest thing is like, you're not alone, and just knowing that you're not alone really, really seems to almost take away part of that stress. Still super stressful. So I'm very appreciative of that. I had a non-malignant program, was very, very lucky to be in a very supportive program. Some, maybe other people had some complaints here and there. I certainly didn't. Yeah, but so I'm also coming from a point of privilege of having come from a program that was non-malignant.
Yeah. No, I think it's a grind. It's hard. It's nonstop. It probably creates a little bit for those that are vulnerable to it, like myself, trains you to be just nonstop and go, go, go. You're used to that grind. It's kind of the pace you've been taking, and it's hard to, downshift at times. So you have to be intentional and aware. But I would say that if people feel like they're in a place that they want to quit, like you said, and maybe they don't have that kind of support from administration, your department, to just go talk to somebody that's already done it, or maybe someone that's going through it with you, but sometimes someone who's not so close to it, but has been through it, and get a sense that you're not alone, I think is a big learning lesson there. And it's amazing how comforting that can be. It doesn't take away the hard work, but it makes it seem like you can handle, like you'll be able to handle it. It's just gonna feel like it sucks for a while. And I still remember being thrown in the first year, and at the Veterans Hospital had a case that suddenly had some unexpected blood loss. And I didn't have anyone there. The attending was there. And actually it was one of the very seasoned CRNAs or nurse anesthetists that came to my aid, because I felt like I was like turning around in circles, like I was hanging blood and running over here and trying to get another IV and like doing everything myself. And it's like, you need a team, you need someone to help you. And I reflected back on how crazy that was, on what I was being dealt at that time for such little experience, and not wanting this patient to die because of me. Like, I mean, the amount of stress that's on you, and then trying to figure out the difficult airway situation, and then no one's there to be there, and they can't get there in time because they're in another difficult airway in another room. Frightening. It can be frightening. I mean, I didn't freeze. I was still moving and doing, but the amount of, I don't even want to know like how hard my adrenal glands were working during that first year.
You're squozen like the lemons, and they were dry at the end. But... and lack of sleep. I mean, throw that on top of the mix. Yeah. But... so that was interesting, and so if you're in the middle of residency and you think it's hard, it is. Welcome to the party. It is. Generally, it will get better on the other side, though. So, like Melissa just said, one of the best things you can do is find somebody who's on the other side to do that emotional forecasting. Get their opinions first. Ask them what their feelings are in that new scenario, because you, in the throes of all that, are not going to be able to predict what your future feelings are going to be very well. So that was a big takeaway. The other one that I think was really important to highlight is when she started a podcast. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned is because she was getting these questions all the time, mm-hmm. and was interesting because she said, I didn't know the answers, right? So she is a urologist. They're surgeons of the genital urinary tract, right? And they don't learn necessarily about sex. Sex is much more about the psychological side. There are some physical parts, but there's a lot of psychological parts to it as well. And then she went out and learned. And I think the takeaway for listeners here and which we briefly touched on in Saturday Salutations, is the advantage of being a doctor is we know how to learn things. And even more importantly, we have the baseline knowledge of what those words mean. There's a lot of people who read stuff and they don't know what the words mean. They think they know what they mean. And then they come away with again, there's some crazy stuff out there where we got people who don't have medical backgrounds with podcasts making health and giving health advice. And fundamentally, they don't understand the meanings of the words. Medical school is really about learning a new language. Once you have that language, you can then learn the text, right? And you have the capability from that environment to learn new material like she did. So I love that. And probably it's the same way with, like, we in our parallel tracks here is when I'm a fellowship trained pains physician and you come through and then you're like, wait a second, I know mechanics similar to surgery. I know the mechanics of how nerve pathways work and the different types of receptors and things. But the whole aspect of pain that we weren't taught, which is all that cognitive processing and that neural processing things, I had to learn that after fellowship, but I could do it because of the medical language that I knew. So if you are a physician and you have something and you're like, hey, this is confusing to me and my patients are asking about it, learn it. You can do it. And then you have an even better service that you can offer to people. So I love that. I absolutely love that quest for learning.
Well, this brings a huge point, because you made a comment about in what she was doing, she didn't understand some things when it came to, from a sex standpoint, you're talking about the psychological part. But the irony of it is people don't think in society of it as a psychological thing. They think of it as oh, my penis doesn't stay up, or I'm not feeling like it wants to come up. Or as for women, I don't have much of a sex drive, or my husband thinks I'm broken. And by the way, the podcast for her is You're Not Broken. But her biggest message that I felt like that episode shared was that your brain is your biggest sex organ. And that's where it's kind of like, it reminds me of this whole pain thing we've talked about, like people's perception of what the issue is may not be at all what the issue is. And so there's a disconnect. Not only did she say that there's really, in her words, shitty education on sex from a medical standpoint, it's just not great. Even psychiatrists, psychologists, they just don't usually talk about it. That's why you got sex therapists, so they can talk about it, not participate or watch anything, just like talk about it. but that's the thing, is that there's all these situations where certain experts don't really know some of the details they should, but the perception of the public is that they need, help with the mechanics, and not understanding the holistic approach to how the complex human being experiences sex, or, when we talked about pain, kind of same thing. But it's just so much more complicated than the public understands. So you got these professionals that don't learn the things, we're giving the wrong messaging in our education, or lack of education, and the society already has this bias or perception of this, and we're not even like, that's why I think her podcast is brilliant. Yes, sex sells, but to get it from a reputable source that's trying to merge all of the wellness and other non-medically trained kind of things with the medical, I think that's prime real estate right there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that brings us up into point number 3 or 4, which I can't remember exactly.
Okay.
And this one is, so she decides, about potentially starting a podcast or whatever. And she has that clarion call. I think she said she was in the shower or whatever, and the voice from the blue. But really, nobody's going to give you permission to do this. And this is so easy. This idea of imposter syndrome. I'm not good enough. Who am I to give this information? And unfortunately, the people who probably should be suffering from imposter syndrome aren't suffering from imposter syndrome. So I would advocate, if you actually feel that way, that's probably the reason that you need to do it. Because at least you're self-aware of the fact of the things that you don't know, as well as the things that you do know, and you can learn though. I mean, that's the other key thing is anytime you start, you can start educating while you are being educated as well. Right. And I would that's probably the most exciting kind of journey in many ways, is you're learning and then you get so excited and you want to teach it to somebody else, and then you actually learn it even more, but nobody's going to give you that red light. And so all these podcasts out there, like our podcasts, anything that we've done, it's not because someone said you need to do this. Well, I should say, it's not because anybody said that you are now appointed and you can do this. Is ultimately we made the choice to do it. And in this day and age, with the internet as it is and all the resources that we have, if you have a message, you can do it. But if you're waiting for someone to give you permission, or you're waiting for the next book to become the designated expert, that's not going to work, because there's always more to learn. And that concentric circle of learning it gets bigger and bigger, but the edge of what you don't know becomes bigger, and you become more and more aware of all the things that you don't know. You just got to keep that in mind, is the fact that you will never feel prepared, but no one's also going to say, okay, at this point, you should go start your podcast. You're a physician, you finish your training, you have good knowledge, you have expertise and you want to delve into the podcast. Maybe you're developing your expertise and you want to share that journey as you go through the podcast. You can do it. You don't need anybody to tell you just that it's okay for you to start now.
Yeah, it reminds me of that, being comfortable with uncomfortable. But I was just thinking, like, seeking certainty requires uncertainty. Like, in order to, like, you have to have some uncertainty to along that journey of certainty. Not that we ever know everything, but there's that sense of, I'll figure it out as I go, and I know I'm not going to know everything at the beginning, and you just move forward. But I think the biggest, most important thing is knowing, what do your patients need? What is it that this world needs? What value can you give them? Maybe what you're passionate about. Or she, like you said, she was recognizing the questions she couldn't answer. So if there's confusion out there, then maybe be, a kind of a beacon of clarity for some people, and education. And just the fact that how many people really are physicians, first of all, that have that route and that expertise or background, doesn't mean you know everything. No one knows everything, and you have to be okay with that. And I think, like you said, as physicians, or being in the medical field, you kind of see things from a different light than the typical public, and you kind of, it's normal for you to question things. So we naturally question ourselves too, and some more than others. But I think that's healthy, and you just have to do it. It looked like you were about to say something.
I was just going to say, it's sort of hitting that imposter syndrome. And the other part about it is, when you're a physician and you think you don't know, you actually know a whole lot more than you actually think you know. And we touched that in episode 143, which was just before this episode, in the Curse of Knowledge, where we talk about the problem is you forget what you didn't know.
Right.
And so all the stuff that you think is simple and everybody knows, I pretty much guarantee that few people actually know it, because you've completed a degree of training that the large percentage of the population has not done.
Right. So you got to hand up on that, and if you want to help out people, share it with the world. But I think maybe we should jump into the second interview we had with her.
Second interview. What was the title of that one?
Clitoris. No, sorry, sex. I mean, really, that's the message. Don't forget the clitoris.
Don't forget the clitoris. Yeah.
That could have been a title too, but maybe even a billboard title to everyone, even if they didn't listen to it. It's like, oh, okay. But really, what is the clitoris? That was a point too, that everyone thinks it's this little, dot in the middle of the whole female anatomy. But I think the coolest way to describe it was how she talked about how the anatomy of the women, we don't always think, she talks about, females and males are homologs. So, even simply thinking about how the testicles descend from internally down into the scrotum, and, ours as females are still up in the abdomen. And so it's, when you think of the penis and all the different structures, if it was to be kind of flowered out and kind of hidden behind the skin structures that typically are associated with females, there's a lot going on neurally and receptor wise that can contribute to a woman's arousal and to actually have an orgasm, which the other thing that was quite revealing is just, and you can go look up percentages if you're listening to this, but when they did studies of like heterosexual male female pairs and homosexual females and homosexual male, like who is the happiest, who gets the most orgasms, the heterosexual female is the lowest on the list. And but the homosexual females are doing all right. So it's quite interesting to, when you think about how we're pornography and other types of lack of medical education really on sex, because we don't learn that stuff and we don't share it with people, so people get their sex education in formats that are more targeted towards heterosexual males many times. So the activities that, and understanding the anatomy of the female is kind of left by the wayside. And so I think what she was revealing is that women are not broken, and there is some serious flaws in our education for sex. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
I just went right at it.
I know. You can pause and you talk 3 topics and then we have to go back.
Yes. Your thoughts on all those topics?
Well, I'll just kind of touch on the clitoris part, because that was the interesting thing is the anatomy. Like the clitoris is so much bigger than people think.
Yes.
It's actually a huge organ. But the major takeaway I got from that particular part was the question of specificity. Mm-hmm. And we think about this. So when we're talking about like sexual dysfunction disorders and things, and she has this podcast because she had these women coming in all the time who believed that they were broken. And there is, in many ways, a falsely created narrative around sex that somehow women are less sexual than men and all this stuff, right? The social, cultural, tech context of that, and the Victorian age and Puritans and all this influences coming in. But when you really think about it, and what I love that she actually specifically stated was the clitoris has one purpose and one purpose only. Unlike anything else, any other organ for the man, right? The clitoris is only a sexual organ. And people will say, well, a penis is a sexual organ. It is, but it's not just a sexual organ. Mm-hmm. So, and I was like, that is huge. Mm-hmm. That is huge. Yeah, so that was a big one, and I think that's like, yeah. So if you're a woman and you think you're broken and you think, oh, sex is not something for me, well, a woman is unlike the man, you actually have an organ that is strictly devoted to sex, and it's 100% of its job. And it makes me, as someone who doesn't have one of those, say, man, I wish I had one of those.
Well, you have a penis. So let me just say, what's interesting about our conversation too, because of the point you made, is that men are grabbing that to go to the bathroom from a young child. They're very comfortable. There's no negativity associated with that. They can even go pee on the yard if they want to. I mean, they use it for, multiple things. So for women, because it's so isolated and solely for pleasure, sexual organ, and the little mini penis is hidden under the hood and it's underneath everything, it's like all hidden. It's not, many women aren't, because they don't understand the anatomy, it's poorly taught, and many women don't explore that area. Not all, there's definitely women that do, but biologically, almost all men touch their penis by the time they're grade school, because
it's very hard not to. Yeah, I was just like,
exactly. Well, that's what I'm saying.
Very hard.
It'd be a big mess if you didn't. but I'm just saying, look at the amount of comfort you have with that.
That's true.
But women, it's kind of like a negative thing or an unexplored thing. Mm-hmm. And there's very few that are guided, educated, comfortable, confident with that being okay. So it's no surprise that we have uninformed females exploring their relationships with men and thinking that all sex is about vagina and penis, when reality is the vagina serves multiple things for us, but the pleasure center is traditionally, most of the time, related to the clitoris. So that's why
related to, because as we mentioned to earlier, the other part about it is the largest sex organ in the body is the brain.
The brain, right?
And there's multiple reasons for that, because the center of your experience is the brain, and like once you know that, that's world changing stuff.
Right.
Like, we really understand it because it goes way beyond sex, folks.
Yes.
You know.
Well, and if they've had bad things happen to them, they think it's dirty for them to touch themselves, then they're not touching the thing that can get things excited. Like there's just, like we've said about a lot of things, people have oversimplified certain phenomena in the human condition, and it's always a little bit more complicated than people like to make it.
Yeah, but it doesn't need to be so. I mean, it is more complicated, but we can still simplify it into.
We'll say it's complex, but we don't need to make it complicated.
That's a great way to say it. That's a great way to say it. Yeah.
Well,
that way they were not like, falling into the mechanic role of, which is a different problem or a large problem. So another one that I really, really liked, the differences between spontaneous desire.
Yes.
And responsive desire. In fact, I think I even said, could you repeat that? Because I missed the first word.
Yeah, I was hoping she was going to get to it.
Huh?
I was hoping she was going to get to it, so I'm glad you brought it up again later.
Yeah, okay. So what were your thoughts about the differences between spontaneous and responsive desire?
Well, I think many, if you're going to look at spontaneous, I would say men more than women tend to have, from a testosterone level, might have this, they haven't even gone out on the town yet, and they're thinking, I need to get laid. Like they have this spontaneous desire. Now it can be associated with other stuff because you've had it multiple times, you just enjoy it and just want it again. But I think she had a lot of good points, and I probably wouldn't say it as good as she does, but the responsive aspect, I can't remember, she used some kind of metaphor. Was it ice cream, or or coffee beans and water? Like certain things are required. Like you don't really need spontaneous desire to enjoy sex. Like most people will have there'll be a responsive desire if put in the right circumstance, which a lot of physicians, if you're thinking, how is any of this related to the Changed Physician? I would say putting yourself in a situation where you're spending time relaxing, getting out of frontal brain stuff, cognitive, like planning, doing. It's hard to be in the mood or get yourself in the mood if your environment is not conducive to that. So I know that she was encouraging people, not that you have to go have sex, but have good sex if you're going to have sex. And the spontaneous part is not required, but the responsive part, if you put yourself in a good environment for that, you can really enjoy some great sex.
Well, and I think that kind of returns back to the societal role, right? So where does sex education take place in this country? Most of it takes place in the movie theaters or TV screen. Mm-hmm. And what do the movie theaters and TV screens do?
Spontaneous.
It's all spontaneous, mm-hmm. Right? And somehow people like run into whoever in the elevator and they're ripping off the clothes and they're on the beach in the sand, which is getting sand everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, it's ridiculous, but then people have this idea that somehow they're just supposed to want, and it's all spontaneous or whatever, when the fact of the matter is, and particularly we have two different individuals, there's a lot of times maybe spontaneous for one and somebody else may be responsive, where they have to be in that scenario where they can be open to it. We didn't talk about this specifically in the episode, but this is one of their ideas around scheduling sex, which I think is really important for physicians. If you're a busy individual and you schedule everything else that's important in your life, then maybe you should schedule everything in your life that's important in life. I mean, and that doesn't take away the fact that you can still have spontaneous, like I think that's returning to the media.
That's a bonus.
But, you see sometimes these movies, and I can't think of the specific one I'm trying to remember right now, but like where they have a busy couple and somehow they actually like they scheduled sex, or like, well, it was going to be Tuesday or whatever. And it was supposed to be like, oh, look at, that's a negative work. This relationship isn't working. And actually, no, they're two busy professionals and they're scheduling things that are important. But instead it gets overlaid in these things like, oh, it's not spontaneous. It's not whoever Hollywood, and they should just have this desire oozing out of their pores. And when they walk into the kitchen, they want to, throw the oil on the ground and go at it. No, I mean, could that happen? Yes. But you schedule the things that are important to you. So I really like that kind of differentiation between spontaneous desire versus responsive desire. And it's not either or, it's really and recognizing there's a time and place for both.
Yeah. And I think and I think she would say something along the lines that it's not to pressure that certain things have to happen. It's more to create the space for that, if that's, what you take it to, or it could just be cuddling or holding each other, or, it's just sacred time together that, you can develop it on whatever flows at that time. Don't you think?
Yeah, no, it just flows at that time.
Some of these words we're using are just like a little too related. No, I think you just, I want people to go listen to that episode, because I think it's very revealing and how we've been ignoring certain parts to this whole, sexual satisfaction for males and females, especially in heterosexual relationships. But that so many things that psychologically affect females is, to remind them they're not broken, and that a lot of this is just the culmination of bad education and how we think about ourselves or how other people are viewing things. And we're all influenced by our environment. And so I think it's a reminder that things can be shifted. So
things can be shifted. And it's just I would highly recommend the podcast. That's what it really comes down to. You got somebody who's educated, knows the ins and outs, they know the mechanics, and they know, the rest of the manual as well. Yeah, some of the takeaways when she was just kind of mentioning what she's done with the podcast and reaching people. I mean, we have enough problems in this country with sex. It is. Well, there's a lot of areas of the globe that's even worse.
Yes.
So, the fact that she's reaching them and the impact that is providing them, and they have a source of good quality information, amazing. So I'm just going to harken back again, like you said, and say, you guys need to listen to the episode or both of those episodes. They're really fantastic. And as I said, check out You Are Not Broken, whether you're a man or a woman. I mean, it's good, useful information for everybody. If you're in a relationship, or you're planning on a relationship, or you're even thinking about a relationship, it's probably something that you're going to need to know about.
Or if you're single and want to understand why you should know yourself better. Yeah, definitely. Well, take us out then.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today for their deep dive and the amazing Dr. Kelly Casperson and her podcast, that You Are Not Broken. For those of you who would like to learn more about the Changed Physician, you can go to changedphysician.com, whether you're a physician or physician ally. As always, give us some feedback, give us a rating and review if you're up for it. And until next time, stay well.
Take care.